One.
Hi guys. I'm hoping this is recording. There we go. All right, looks like recording. I hope this is working well. My computer is old and nothing lights a fire under you to get a new computer than e-learning. So I saw you guys earlier today, and since I am showered and actually put a little makeup on today, I thought I'd record Friday's lesson so that you didn't have to watch me with bedhead later in the week. So I like to work ahead. Yet another reason or way that McGarity and I are different. So today, as promised, is our last lesson on World War II. So on Wednesday, on Thursday. Wednesday is Cammie's 5 mile walk day. Thursday, you worked on your project. So today, Friday, you're just going to take some notes over this lecture, and then I've got the review sheet for you. Your test will be Tuesday. I will post it at 8:30, and you must have it completed by 4. I am giving you plenty of time to take a very short test. I would like to remind you that the test is to test your knowledge, not your knowledge of how to Google, not your knowledge of how to text a friend. Um, do it yourself. I promise you, you guys are going to do well. I know you know the stuff. So let's kind of get to it. I had you last week do a web quest on the Pacific War. I like that web quest because it takes you through that island hopping that we talked about, or leapfrogging, and it shows you the really specific strategic islands that the United States and Australia take. So on that, you read about the Battle of Midway, which was a turning point in the Pacific War. Prior to the Battle of Midway, the Japanese were able to take land after land after land from us, and they were gaining all this strategic positioning. And had they taken Midway, we would not have a foothold in the Pacific from which to launch an attack. Another big loss in the Pacific early in the war was in the Philippines, where Douglas MacArthur was the general in charge, and he was ordered by his commanders to retreat from the Pacific. And that's when he gives his famous speech, "I shall return." And he is forced to retreat in 1942 from the Pacific, or from the Philippines. He goes down towards Australia, and from there he fights his way back north. And when he lands, as you can imagine, he says, "I have returned." MacArthur's kind of an interesting character in this war. He's kind of one of those robust and feisty type of guys, like Patton. And we'll actually talk about him in the 1950s because he'll lead the armed forces in the Korean War. So I know I'm skimming over a lot of stuff that I would normally go a little bit more depth into, but that's where we are. So let's talk a little bit about leapfrogging today. We're going to talk about getting towards Japan and then how we ultimately end the war in Japan. So I mentioned already that in 1942, we're able to hang on to Midway just slightly less than a year after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then from Midway, Nimitz and his troops will leapfrog their way west towards the mainland of Japan. Meanwhile, you had MacArthur, who had to retreat from the Philippines, go down south towards Australia, and then he will island hop his way back till he gets to the Philippines and then towards the mainland. So both, as I told you when I was in my classroom teaching, both Nimitz and MacArthur are moving towards each other, towards the mainland of Japan. So that's the plan, and that's how that's kind of where we left off. So I just want to talk quickly about a couple of these chunks of land that are really, really close to Japan. So as we start to island hop our way towards Japan, we end up having more hand-to-hand, man-to-man combat. I mentioned already that obviously air and sea are hugely important in this war. Well, as we get closer to the mainland of Japan, we are actually going to be physically on the ground fighting the Japanese. We were in these other places as well, but it's going to become much more desperate and much more brutal the closer we get to their borders. Iwo Jima in February of 1945 is another one of those turning points in the war in the Pacific. Iwo Jima is a tiny island, smaller than Manhattan. And what happened at Iwo Jima is this little island, and it's got a big old volcano at the end of it. And what the Japanese did is they built tunnels and caves inside this high ground. And we all know how important high ground is. And what the Americans had to do is we did an amphibious landing on the beaches here. This should sound familiar, almost sounds like D-Day, right? And the difference, though, is when we land at D-Day, we can kind of see the enemies. At Iwo Jima, we can't. Most of the men, the Americans that fought at Iwo Jima, said that they never saw a live Japanese because the gunfire is coming from beneath them and within this mountain. The goal of the Japanese were hugely outnumbered at Iwo Jima, and they knew that they were probably going to die, but their goal was to take out at least 10 Americans before they themselves lost their lives. This is an example of how different our ideas and our mentality is with regard to war. The Japanese believe that they are fighting for a divine goodness for their emperor. They will die gladly and give their lives for their emperor. They have pilots that call themselves kamikazes, known as divine wind, that would crash their planes into a target rather than eject and survive. American planes go down, they eject and they use their parachute and they try to live. That is not what the Japanese do. It is better to die for your country than to live for it. And so Iwo Jima is a great example of this clash of cultures in World War II. Part of the reason I take the time to talk about this particular battle is it does get us closer to the mainland of Japan than we had been at any point up until then in the war. Next, we'll move to Okinawa, and that's another one it's practically in their backyard. But also, this is one of the places where the Marines really make their mark. And this, my dad would kill me if I didn't teach about Iwo Jima. So here you see some examples of their tunnels. But this is the famous picture you all know from Iwo Jima, right? This flag on top of the mountain. You guys can all picture where it is in DC. It's very familiar to you. Some of you are thinking, oh, the quarantine's gotten to Horner because we've never seen this picture before. Well, you should have, because this is the flag raising. When we are able to overtake the Japanese and use flamethrowers and grenades and get them out of those tunnels, a group of soldiers then moves onto Mount Sarabaki and puts the American flag up. And a photographer is there. And he says, you know what? That wasn't a very good picture. Would you guys mind doing it again? And so they do. And you say, oh, now that's a familiar picture. And if you're thinking it's not, then maybe this will help. Okay, that it becomes the Marine Corps Memorial. So it is seen as, I love, this is my favorite monument in DC. And there's many to choose from, but it's such a beautiful picture. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning picture. And you see, it's all of these men working together towards one goal. And it's this American flag, which is this victorious, unifying goal. And it's just, it's just patriotism in a picture, and now a monument. When I ran the Marine Corps Marathon 3 years ago, maybe, this is where you ended. So the Marine Corps Marathon's in DC, and you run alongside Arlington National Cemetery, and then the finish line is this memorial, and there's a bunch of Marines cheering for you. It's beautiful. Yeah, if you're going to run a marathon, run that one. Cried my eyes out. So once we hit Iwo Jima and then eventually Okinawa, and I think Okinawa was on your WebQuest, then we have this ability to launch attacks on the mainland of Japan. So think about it in the terms of the United States, right? If people wanted to damage the United States, they might have to work their way towards us, maybe through Central America, through Cuba, things that were off our borders. But if you truly, truly, truly want to get to the United States and bring us to our knees, you've got to hit our mainland. Think 9/11, right? Um, so we start in 1945 a firebombing campaign in Tokyo. Because we have this land in Okinawa and Iwo Jima, we now have a place to launch our planes and land our planes. We also have refueling stations. So now we could really wreak havoc on the Japanese Empire. And the majority of their population is now going to feel that impact. So as we start to firebomb Tokyo, we also drop pamphlets to the Japanese warning them that severe destruction could be coming their way, encouraging them to turn on the empire and encourage them to surrender. The firebombing of Tokyo, basically, we just took gasoline filled bombs and just dropped them over the center of the city. And we were looking for military targets, but of course, you're in a major city like Tokyo, many civilian targets will be hit. And what happens with these fire bombs is they explode overhead. So then the fire spreads from building to building. And the damage is just unbelievable. Tokyo is practically leveled by these fire bombs. And the Japanese show no sign of surrender. They believe that you fight till the end. The United States, by the time we're firebombing Tokyo, had already decided we were only going to accept an unconditional surrender from them, which meant that they were going to just have to be at our mercy and give in to whatever desires we had. So they were showing no signs of surrendering. And then on April 12th of 1945, good old Franklin Roosevelt is going to have a bad day. He is actually up in his estate at Warm Springs, Georgia. He was taking a little break. He was getting kind of tired. As you can imagine, the poor guy, he was suffering from the effects still of polio. He had gotten us through the Depression. Now he's getting us through World War II. And on April 12th, he is up in Warm Springs, Georgia, not with his wife. He is there with Lucy Mercer. Mic drop. Yes, that's the woman he had an affair with that was Eleanor's personal secretary that he swore he would never see again. Well, his daughter, Anna, was his kind of personal aide during the last part of the war, and she was taking good care of him. And one day he asked her if she would set up a lunch between him and Lucy Mercer. You can imagine as a daughter, if your dad asked you to arrange a lunch with a mistress, I mean, someone that broke your mom's heart. What a horrible thing. She was furious. And then she eventually relented, set up the lunch. And what she realized is that his relationship with Lucy made him healthier mentally, that she brought relaxation to him. Whereas Eleanor was always like, you got to do more, you got to do more. And so she would sometimes kind of turn a blind eye and help him meet up with Lucy. So he and Lucy were up in Warm Springs, Georgia, along with a couple of his cousins. And she asked him to sit for a portrait. She's like, I don't have a good portrait of you. Will you sit for this portrait? He says, yeah, whatever. So he sits down, he's being painted, and he says, I have a terrific headache. And with that, he slumps over. And they believe he died of essentially an aneurysm. Eleanor gets word she's actually at a public luncheon and gets word that she needs to, there's an emergency. She goes up to Warm Springs, Georgia, finds out what happened. Franklin's cousin tells her that Lucy was there. She's not happy about it, but she ends up forgiving her daughter and moving on. So you have that's Anna and Eleanor there, and they will remain close. But there's Lucy. So Lucy was back in the picture there at the end. Kind of a scandalous, busted ending to Franklin Roosevelt. You can imagine the country is beside themselves. He has been our president since 1932. He's been elected 4 times to office. There's a whole generation of people that don't remember anybody but Franklin Roosevelt in the White House. And more importantly, we're at like the pinnacle of the war. It may be won, but it could also all be lost. And the guy that was chosen to be his vice president, most people don't know anything about him. He's from a state that people aren't really sure how to pronounce. Is it Missouri? Is it Missouri? I don't know. So Harry Truman will now become president of the United States. When he is at Franklin Roosevelt's funeral, he walks up to Eleanor and says, "Ma'am, is there anything I can do for you?" And she says, "No, sir. Is there anything I can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." Harry Truman never really loves the White House. He saw it as the most glamorous cage that a person could be in, but he believed that it was his duty to do his best in this position. He was in a tough position because Franklin Roosevelt was very secretive. He did not keep his vice president in the loop. And Harry is going to have a baptism by fire. We'll talk a little bit more about Harry Truman's background. He's one of my favorite people in history. But here's his wife, Bess, and his daughter, Margaret. I don't know if I've told you this before, but he had a little bit of a temper. And when Harry would get mad, and he used to get mad like when people would criticize his daughter. She was a concert pianist, and sometimes she'd get bad reviews. He would write scathing letters to the editor and whoever was ripping on his daughter. And they were awful. And then he'd bury him in a drawer and he'd wait 24 hours and then he'd throw him away. And I'm thinking, oh man, he would be a really good tutor for all of us and mentor for all of us in this social media world where you think something and then you vomit it into the airways. He was just very measured. He was very different from Franklin Roosevelt. If you asked Harry Truman a question, he gave you an answer. If you said, "Are you going to bomb, Tokyo today?" He'd say, "Yes, in 10 minutes. Whereas Franklin would say, "Bomb, one time I ate a bomb pop and blah, blah, blah." And he'd give you this whole cool story and people would be so excited. And then he'd walk away and you'd realize he never answered a question. So Harry Truman's going to be a much more direct person. He's famous for his phrase, "The buck stops here. If I say something, we're going to do it. And that's it." And he's just going to bring a very different vibe to the White House. He is much more vibrant. He is much healthier. And he is a very straightforward Midwesterner. So one of the things he knew nothing about when he became president was a little project called the Manhattan Project. This is J. Robert Oppenheimer, fondly referred to as Oppie. He is the lead scientist in charge of the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project was a project designed to develop and harness the power of the atom. A guy I think you guys have heard of by the name of Albert Einstein had sent a letter to the United States and said, "Hey, listen, the Germans have split the atom. They're going to do something maniacal with it. You had better start developing something first." So when Einstein tells you to do something, you don't go, "Yeah, where's the evidence?" You do it. So they did it. The Manhattan Project is a project that's going to actually spread across the country. It's going to be in the Midwest, actually in the University of Chicago, down under Stagg Field. They're going to have their first nuclear reaction. We're going to be harnessing the power of different elements all around the country, and it is the best kept secret, or so we think, of the war. So what Oppie has to do is he collects some of the brightest minds in science. And what they do is they go to Los Alamos, New Mexico. So they go into the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, right? To have this secretive project to try to harness the power of uranium and plutonium. So the goal is we're going to build two different types of bombs. There was another guy that actually wanted to build a third type of a bomb, a hydrogen bomb. But we decided, the scientists decided that was just too drastic and maybe too soon. We'll build it eventually, and I'll show you the difference in the effects of that. So in New Mexico, these guys are going to collectively work on how you can harness the power of plutonium and uranium and create an explosive device. Now, while this is going on, we are meeting with our allies during the war. While the war is going on, we have several wartime conferences to determine the course of the war and what it will look like when the war ends. We recognize in World War II that World War I ended horribly, that we did not plan properly for peace. So we start the planning process long before the war even ends. And so here you see Stalin Churchill and a very, very feeble looking Roosevelt. Well, the first war conference that Truman will go to will be in Potsdam, Germany. It is after Germany has surrendered. It'll be the first time he meets Stalin, whom he calls Uncle Joe. Um, and his goal in going to Potsdam, the war has ended in Europe. His goal is to get his allies to join him in the war against Japan in the Pacific. While he is there, while they are there, they decide to issue what's called the Potsdam Declaration. The Potsdam Declaration is basically an ultimatum to Japan saying surrender unconditionally now or prepare for utter destruction. So we're warning them that if you don't surrender, we're going to blow you to smithereens. Well, Truman, by this time, when he becomes president, he is informed that we, in fact, are pretty close to developing these atomic bombs. He goes to Potsdam thinking that he's the only one who knows it. It turns out there were spies all over Los Alamos. So Uncle Joe knew that we were going to have this bomb. While he is there, the first atomic bomb will be detonated. That bomb was called Trinity. Trinity will be detonated successfully on July 16th of 1945. No, you don't need to know that date. And when they detonate it, the scientists really don't know what to expect. They don't know if it's going to be a dud. They don't know if it's going to just fizzle. They don't know if it's going to blow so big that it kills all of them. They have a lot of predictions. They've got a lot of guesses. But what ends up happening is we see that first real mushroom cloud as a result. So while Potsdam is happening, Truman gets word that we have the atomic bomb. And he knows in that moment that we militarily are the strongest country in the world, on the planet for sure. So unfortunately, Uncle Joe gets a message just about at the same time. So here's what's going to happen. We send the message from Potsdam, the declaration to Japan. We say, you surrender now, period. And Japan goes, I don't think so. We continue to send planes over Tokyo. The Japanese are being told during this time that if they surrender to the Americans, we will disembowel them. We will rape their children. We will torture them. As we start moving closer and closer to the mainland of Japan, there will be Japanese citizens that will jump to their deaths rather than surrender to Americans. So they are terrified of us. So Truman then has a decision to make. We are successful in detonating Trinity. We have 2 other bombs ready. Should he use them? So it's easy in 2020 to look back, hindsight's 2020, to look back and think, no, that was terrible. You annihilated all these people. But think about the numbers of people who are already dead and wounded in World War II. As of by the time August of 1945 has rolled around, we're well surpassed 40 million deaths worldwide. It's unbelievable. And so he's thinking to himself, okay, what's going to be the cost to Americans if I don't use these bombs? So here are some of the justifications that Truman has used in his decision. And the number one decision was it would end the war successfully at the earliest possible moment. He says, how do I hang on to these bombs, know I have them, and send American men onto the mainland of Japan and even let one of them die when I know that I could save their lives? If you're a military family, if you've got friends in the military, you understand that a little bit. There were predictions that if the Americans landed on the mainland of Japan and invaded by land, there would be as many as 1 million American casualties. And that's a pretty big number. And, if the moms of those people find out you had those bombs, what do they say? He said it's a justified effort and expense of building the bombs. It offered hope of achieving diplomatic gains in our growing rivalry with the Soviet Union. There was a lack of incentives not to use the weapons, and We really, really hated the Japanese at this time. Really, that entire generation of Americans is going to have a pretty sour view of the Japanese for a very long time. And some of you might have great grandparents who lived through World War II, and they probably do not speak about the Japanese in a way that you think is acceptable, that they just have this long lasting dislike for an entire country. So here are the bombs. Fat Man is this big fat round one at the top. That's the uranium bomb. The plutonium bomb is called Little Man. Fat Man and Little Boy. I'm sorry, Little Boy. I'm delirious. So back before PowerPoint, I did all this research on the bombs. I was so proud of myself. And I drew the bombs up on the board. I had Fat Man, and I even knew how they detonated, how the uranium dropped down into these rings. And then that's what caused the atomic bomb to explode. Oh, it was beautiful. And I drew it up, and I had my back to the kids, and it was a chalkboard, and I was so excited. And I turned around, and I am not kidding you, I was like, I kind of expected applause. Like it was really impressive. I know I laugh about how I draw. This was beautiful, and it was scientific, and it was technical, and it was so not me. And I turned around, and the whole class was like this. And I'm like, they're in awe. And then this kid teaches across the hall from me now, Mr. Garrison, starts giggling. And I'm like, what? And I turn around. Well, I'd drawn Little Boy. So I'm going to let you use your imagination. As I'm standing in front of the kids, looming over me on the chalkboard is the largest phallic symbol you've ever seen. So yeah, I'm really glad I have PowerPoint. I'm glad I could show you pictures, and I will never draw the atomic bombs again. I love telling that story, especially since I then hired Mr. Garrison. So the first bomb, Fat Man, the first bomb will go aboard the Enola Gay. I'm sorry, I got like 3 hours sleep last night. The Enola Gay was the plane that was named for Paul Tibbets, the captain, the pilot's mother. And they are going to take the bomb up and over Hiroshima. Some of you might say Hiroshima. That is absolutely fine. Go for it. This is going to be the first atomic bomb. The first atomic bomb will be dropped, and it is a devastation we never, ever in the history of the world could have imagined. So we get this, this mushroom cloud, and then we see beneath it, over ground zero. So ground zero is where the detonation happens, the area directly underneath it. So ground zero was just a little bit off of the center of city. It was actually a little bit off of its target. So a couple years ago, I actually went to Hiroshima, and this building that you see in front of you, it's called the Atomic Bomb Building, actually. It's still standing, but as a skeleton like this, as a reminder of war. But within ground zero, everything was just incinerated, just completely destroyed. All life forces, all vegetation, all buildings, just everything flattened and dead. The further you got out, there might be like wind damage, there might be fire damage, and it was about a 5-mile radius tops for just that kind of damage. But what we saw in the people was something we'd never seen before. You see on these victims, their clothes and the patterns of their clothes burned onto their body. You see this. This is one of the famous pictures. It's actually at the museum in Hiroshima, where people's shadows were burned onto the buildings. Here you've got some examples of clothing burned onto the buildings. Oh, and there's the building. I'm not really sure why it's sideways, but that's the atomic bomb building today. So what they've done in Hiroshima is they've turned it into a museum for peace. So it's interesting. Having been obviously born and raised in the United States, studied history in the United States, it was interesting to go through that museum and read their placards and their timeline of what had happened. they jump just right to the point of these bombs were used and this devastation resulted. They not a lot about the ultimatums and the stuff that came before it, which is understandable. They don't want to harp on that. They just want to say, right or wrong, we have to end warfare of this kind because it annihilates whole generations of people. It's a beautiful museum. If you ever go to Japan, you have to just take the time and go to Hiroshima. Here's one of the monuments for peace, and then through here, that's the bomb building. And then they've also got children's memorials. So I know some of you are in Drumline, or at least familiar with Drumline. And last year they did the piece with the cranes. So behind me here they almost look like phone booths filled with cranes. People still come here. While I was standing here ringing this children's memorial bell, and this is a crane right there. A crane is a sign for hope and peace. And people from all over the world, their classes make paper cranes and they send them to Hiroshima, and this whole area is just ringed with these cranes. It's unbelievable. And I know the Drumline performance last year was about the book about the 1,000 paper cranes. So very interesting stuff. So what happens is Paul Tibbets and his crew dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, we say, on August 6th of 1945. It's estimated that approximately 90,000 casualties occurred. But if you look at numbers today, they estimate it could be as much as 146,000. Because what we know now is that the people that died within a week or so of their injuries were not the extent of it. For years and years and years, for a generation, people were coming up with these illnesses that they'd never seen before. Radiation illnesses, higher increases in cancer, and things like that. So we'll never have really a solid number of what the casualties were. We sent word to Japan and said, "Are you ready to surrender?" They did not reply. So right after we dropped the first atomic bomb, Stalin says, "Ooh, ooh, 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 I'm joining." And the Soviet Union enters the war. They want to make sure they get a little bit of the victory. So then on August 9th of 1945, we will send the second bomb over in a plane called Boxcar, and it will drop the bomb on Nagasaki. Nagasaki will have slightly less casualties, but extraordinarily devastating as well. And they estimate that to be somewhere maybe around 110 to 120,000 with the radiation stuff factored in. So it is at that point that Japan sends word to the United States, "We're out. We surrender. We quit." So we drop both bombs. We secure the victory over Japan. Japan will formally surrender in May. They'll sign the formal surrender later, but in September of 1945, it is officially over. They will sign the surrender aboard the USS Missouri. I don't know if anybody's been to it. Maybe Peyton West, you might have been, because it's in Hawaii. But they sign it aboard the USS Missouri, and the bloodiest war in American history ends. It is estimated that there's 50 million deaths actually in this war. It is unbelievable. Think about the generations of men we lost, and women, the people that could have cured a coronavirus or something, right? So when we talk about these mass numbers and these massive wars, we've got to look at it as the individual losses that we had. World War II is going to change the way we re-enter the international world. After every war prior to this, the United States becomes a turtle and tucks our head in, and we pull back from the world. We will never do that again, because the last time we turned a blind eye, Mussolini, Hitler, Hirohito rose up and conquered the world. And so we are now going to stay involved, and we are going to have a voice, and we're going to become the policemen of the world. In our next unit, as we start to talk about the 50s, we will enter into what is called a Cold War, and then we'll see where that takes us. All right. I hope you were able to follow all of that. I hope you're all doing well, and good luck on the test on Tuesday. Get your projects done this weekend. See ya.